In today's lesson, we will learn about congruent figures. Take a minute to read over the learning goal and the scale. Find where you are on the scale before we start the lesson. Congruent figures have the same size and shape. When two figures are congruent, you can slide, flip, or turn one so that it fits exactly on the other one. Here we have a translation, a reflection, and a rotation. Remember, all three of those transformations are rigid motion, so their figures will be congruent. You can determine if two figures are congruent by comparing their corresponding parts. Congruent polygons have congruent corresponding parts. They're matching sides and angles. When you name congruent polygons, you must list corresponding vertices in the same order. So for these two polygons, polygon A, B, C, D is congruent to polygon E, F, G, H. Notice angle A is congruent to angle E, angle B is congruent to angle F, angle C is congruent to angle G, and angle D is congruent to angle H. To list our congruent corresponding sides, side AB is congruent to side EF, side BC is congruent to side FG, side CD is congruent, side CD is congruent to side GH, and side DA is congruent to side HE. In example 1, we will find congruent parts. If polygon HIJK is congruent to polygon LMNO, what are the congruent corresponding parts? I find it easiest to use the congruent sentence to match up our congruent corresponding parts rather than looking at the figures, especially if, like this one, the figures have been rotated and reflected. Notice polygon HIJK is first reflected, then rotated in order to become figure LMNO. That's a little more work than using the names. Watch. Since H and L are the first two letters of the polygons, angle H is congruent to angle L. Since I and M are the second two letters of the polygons, angle I is congruent to angle M. Since J and N are the third two letters of the polygons, angle J is congruent to angle N. And since K and O are the last two letters of the polygon, angle K is congruent to angle O. Now, let's use our congruent corresponding angles to help us write a list of our congruent corresponding sides. H and I are my first two letters, and L and M are my first two letters. So side HI will be congruent to side LM. Since I and J are my second two letters, and M and N are my second two letters, side IJ will be congruent to side MN. Since J and K and N and O are our third and fourth letters, I know that side JK will be congruent to side NO. And finally, since H and K and L and O are our first and fourth letters, I know that side HK will be congruent to side LO. And there we have our 4 congruent corresponding pairs of angles and our 4 congruent corresponding pairs of sides. Pause the video and do you try number 1. If triangle WYS is congruent to triangle MKV, what are the congruent corresponding parts? Well, let's look at the names. Since W and M are the first letters, angle W will be congruent to angle M. Since Y and K are our second two letters, angle Y will be congruent to angle K. And since S and V are our last two letters, angle S will be congruent to angle V. Now let's use our list of congruent corresponding angles to help us write our congruent corresponding sides. W and Y and M and K are our first two letters, so side WY will be congruent to side MK. Since Y and S and K and V are our second and third letters, side YS will be congruent to side KV. And since W and S and M and V are our first and third letters, side WS will be congruent to side MV. Here are 3 pairs of congruent corresponding angles and our 3 pairs of congruent corresponding sides. In example 2, we will use congruent parts. The wings of an SR-71 Blackbird aircraft suggest congruent triangles. What is the measure of angle D? Well, I know that angle A will be congruent to angle D, angle B is congruent to angle E, and angle C is congruent to angle F. I also know that the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C will equal 180 degrees. If I substitute 30 degrees for the measure of angle B and 75 degrees for the measure of angle C, I can find the measure of angle A by using the triangle angle sum theorem. Combine like terms, and the measure of angle A plus 105 will equal 180. Use the subtraction property of equality to subtract 105 from both sides, and the measure of angle A will equal 75. Since the measure of angle A is congruent to the measure of angle D, and the measure of angle A equals 75, the measure of angle B or D will also equal 75. So our answer is B. Pause the video and do you try number 2. Suppose the triangle WYS is congruent to triangle MKV. If the measure of angle W is 62 and the measure of angle Y is 35, what is the measure of angle V? Well, angle W and Y are in this triangle, but angle V is in this second triangle. Notice that angle S and angle V are congruent corresponding angles. So if I find the measure of angle S, it will be the same as the measure of angle V. Let's substitute 62 for the measure of angle W and 35 for the measure of angle Y. Now let's combine like terms to get 97 plus the measure of angle S equals 180. Use the subtraction property of equality to subtract 97 from both sides, and we'll get 83 equals the measure of angle S. Since angle S is congruent to angle V because they are corresponding angles, the measure of angle V is also 83 degrees. In example 3, we will find congruent triangles. Here, they want to know if the triangles are congruent, and we must justify our answer. Let's start with the fact that side AB is congruent to side ED because of the congruency marks. Next, we know that side BC is congruent to side DC because both measures are 4. We also know that side AC is congruent to side EC because both segments have lengths of 6. These arcs show that angle A and angle E are congruent. These double arcs show that angle B and angle D are congruent. And because angle BCA and DCE are vertical angles, we know that they are congruent. Since all 3 pairs of corresponding sides are congruent, and all 3 pairs of corresponding angles are congruent, our 2 triangles are congruent. So triangle ABC is congruent to triangle EDC. Pause the video and do you try number 3. Is triangle ABD congruent to triangle CBD? Justify your answer. Well, we can see that side AD is congruent to side CD by the congruent mark. We also know that side DB is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property. We really don't know anything about side AB and CB, nor do we know anything about the 3 corresponding angle pairs, since all we know is that 2 corresponding sides are congruent, but nothing else. We cannot conclude that these 2 triangles are congruent. So we cannot conclude triangle ABD is congruent to triangle CBD because we only know 2 pairs of corresponding sides are congruent. Remember, the sum of the measures of the angles of a triangle is always 180. In theorem 4.1, that comes from the triangle angle sum theorem. So let's have a look at the third angles theorem. If two angles of one triangle are congruent to two angles of another triangle, the third angle of each triangle must be congruent. Let's prove this theorem by starting with the given information. Angle A is congruent to angle D, and angle B is congruent to angle E. That means the measure of angle A is equal to the measure of angle D, and the measure of angle B is equal to the measure of angle E by the definition of congruent angles. By the triangle angle sum theorem, the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C equals 180. Again, using the triangle angle sum theorem, the measure of angle D plus the measure of angle E plus the measure of angle F will also equal 180. Since both of these are equal to 180, let's use substitution and say the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C will equal the measure of angle D plus the measure of angle E plus the measure of angle F. Since the measure of angle A is congruent to the measure of angle D, and the measure of angle B is congruent to the measure of angle E, let's substitute these two angles for these two and say that the measure of angle D plus the measure of angle E plus the measure of angle C will equal the measure of angle D plus the measure of angle E plus the measure of angle F. Now let's use the subtraction property of equality to subtract the measure of angle D and E from both sides. And finally, since the measure of angle C is equal to the measure of angle F, that means angle C is congruent to angle F by the definition of congruent angles. In example 4, we will prove triangles congruent. Let's start with the given information that side LM is congruent to side LO and side MN is congruent to side ON. Next, let's use the reflexive property to state that side LN is congruent to itself. Now, we know that angle MLN is congruent to angle OLN, and angle M is congruent to angle O because it was given. By the third angles theorem, we know that angle MNL and angle LNO are congruent. And finally, since we know that we have 3 pairs of congruent corresponding sides and 3 pairs of congruent corresponding angles, triangle LMN is congruent to triangle LON by definition of congruent triangles. Now pause the video and do you try number 4. Let's prove triangle AEB is congruent to triangle DCB by starting with the given information that angle A is congruent to angle D. We know that angle ABE is congruent to angle DBC because vertical angles are congruent. By the third angle theorem, we know that angle E is congruent to angle C. We also know that side A is congruent to side DC, side EB is congruent to side CB, and side BA is congruent to side BD because it was given. Finally, triangle AEB is congruent to triangle DCB because we have 3 pairs of congruent corresponding angles and 3 pairs of congruent corresponding sides. That is the definition of congruent triangles. Now is your chance to see how well you understand the lesson. Pause the video and complete the lesson check. Don't forget to check your answers on the next slide. Check questions 1 through 4. Now check questions 5 through 7. If you've missed any, be sure to ask me tomorrow in class. Now apply what you've learned in the lesson by attempting the challenge. Take another minute to read over the learning goal and the scale. Have you climbed any higher on the scale after doing the U-tries and the lesson check?